At 83 years old, Harrison Ford is not just a name, he is a part of American film history. Over more than 5 decades on screen, he has appeared in films with a combined global box office gross exceeding $10 billion, making him one of the highest-grossing actors of all time. He is Han Solo in Star Wars, the character who shaped an entire generation of audiences and changed American pop culture. He is Indiana Jones, the immortal adventure icon with the fedora hat and leather whip, a character whose mere shadow on the wall is enough to silence an entire theater. He was nominated for an Oscar for his role in Witness, received the American Film Institute's Life Achievement Award, the Cecil B. DeMille Award at the Golden Globes, and was honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Empire Strikes Back, The Fugitive, Air Force One and Blade Runner were not only commercial successes but also became cinematic benchmarks. For many decades, he has not simply been a box office star. He has been the face representing the American hero archetype, brave, clever, laconic and never backing down. But behind the numbers and the applause is a body that has paid the price over the years. At age 83, Harrison Ford no longer sprints across deserts like he once did. He carries scars from dangerous stunts, a near-fatal plane crash at age 72, dislocated shoulders, spinal injuries, and mornings waking up to nagging pain in his back and knees. Time doesn't ask permission, it quietly wears you down. But what earns people's respect is not that he never fell, but that he always gets back up. After the accident, he learned to walk again. After the injuries, he returned to the set. While many of his peers chose retirement, he kept working because of his love for the craft. His willpower is not loud or flashy, it lies in the quiet persistence of a man who understands that legends are not made by immortality, but by the determination not to surrender to one's own limits. If Harrison Ford's story makes you pause for a moment, please hit subscribe so we can continue the journey behind the spotlight of the man once seen as invincible. Before he became the hero of millions of audiences, before the name Harrison Ford echoed in packed theaters, there was once a boy born in 1942 in Chicago, quiet, skinny, and almost invisible in the crowd. It wasn't a childhood of hunger or wandering the streets. His family was middle class, with enough to eat and wear. But the tragedy of Harrison Ford wasn't about money. It was about the feeling of not being enough, not stand out enough, not special enough, not enough for someone to stop and say, "You did a great job." He was a shy child who stuttered slightly when speaking in front of the class. Every time a teacher called on him, his heart pounded so hard that his words stumbled over each other. The other kids laughed, not maliciously, but enough for the boy to learn to stay silent. He didn't cause trouble, didn't top the class, wasn't an outstanding athlete. He was just there, existing but unnoticed. In old school photos, Harrison often stood at the edge of the frame, eyes looking down, as if afraid that looking straight into the lens would reveal his awkwardness. His father, Christopher Ford, was a strict man who worked in advertising and had some experience in radio acting. He believed in discipline, self-reliance, and that men had to be strong. But that strictness rarely came with gentle encouragement. There were no long hugs, no warm words at the end of the day. Love wasn't absent, but it wasn't expressed in words, and for a sensitive boy like Harrison, that gap slowly became a recurring question in his mind. Am I good enough? His mother, Dorothy, a former radio actress, was gentler but busy with her own life. The family wasn't broken, no loud tragedies, but in that house, Harrison still felt unseen. He wasn't the impressive child. He wasn't the obvious pride. He was just a quiet boy carrying an insecurity no one noticed. At Maine East High School, he wasn't an outstanding student. His grades were average. Teachers didn't remember his name for long. Friends didn't see him as the center of the group. While others dreamed of bright futures, Harrison dreamed cautiously, as if fearing that dreaming too big would expose his inner lack of confidence. The feeling of not enough didn't scream. It whispered. It appeared every time he compared himself to others, every time he heard his father talk about success as a standard to meet. That feeling followed him all the way to college. At Ripon College in Wisconsin, he wasn't a standout student. He signed up for theater class, not out of burning passion, but to overcome his fear of speaking in front of crowds. A quiet paradox. The stuttering boy chose to stand on stage. Perhaps deep down, he hoped that by learning to play someone else, he wouldn't have to face his own insecurity directly. But even on the small college stage, he wasn't a star. He learned slowly, observing more than speaking. No one looking at Harrison Ford in the 1960s saw a future legend. No one bet on him. He didn't have the glamorous Hollywood looks of that era. He didn't have the explosive confidence of ambitious young actors. He had something else, a silent patience born from a lifetime of feeling he had to prove something. The tragedy in Harrison Ford's childhood wasn't cold, hungry nights or loud arguments. The tragedy was the vagueness, growing up without truly believing he could become anything extraordinary, standing in a room full of people and feeling like just a shadow, hearing laughter and wondering if it was for him. That feeling of not enough quietly shaped who he became. It made him work harder when no one was watching. It made him endure failure longer when no one expected anything. It made him never take success for granted. But before those qualities became the foundation of a legend, they were simply the loneliness of a boy who didn't know how to say he was afraid. And perhaps, in that very silence, a resilient will began to form, not loud, not flashy, but strong enough to survive when the lights hadn't yet shone on him. If Harrison Ford's childhood was marked by the feeling of not enough, then his first 10 years in Hollywood were the time he had to face an even harsher truth. Perhaps he would never be enough. After leaving Ripon College without a degree, Ford and his first wife, Mary Marquardt, carried fragile hopes to Los Angeles in the mid-1960s. Hollywood at that time was dazzling, noisy, full of young, beautiful, confident faces. And Harrison, he stepped into the city of dreams with a quiet, almost awkward demeanor, no connections, no reputation, only a vague belief that he could do something on screen. He signed a small contract with Columbia Pictures. That should have been the starting moment. But instead of being given major roles, he only got fleeting bit parts, some even without dialogue. In one of his early films, his name appeared at the very end of the credits, and his role was so brief that if the audience blinked, they wouldn't even realize he had been there. The producers looked at him and didn't see a star. One studio executive bluntly told Ford he had nothing special, not handsome enough by Hollywood standards, not stand out enough, not charismatic enough. Those comments weren't said with malice, but with indifference, and it was the indifference that hurt the most. His contract was quickly terminated. No farewell party, no promises, just a door quietly closing. He tried his luck at other studios, auditioned, waited for phone calls that never came. Each time he walked into an audition room, he hoped this would be the break. Each time he walked out, he felt a little smaller. Those years had no scandals, no dramatic accidents, just the prolonged exhaustion of being overlooked. Meanwhile, real life didn't wait for dreams. Ford had a family, young children. Bills had to be paid, rent had to be covered. He couldn't live off nameless roles, and so he learned carpentry. At first it was just a temporary way to make money, but gradually it became his main job. He built cabinets, installed doors, crafted furniture for families, and even for famous directors. There was a bitter irony in it. The man who wanted to stand in front of the camera spent his days repairing homes for people who had achieved the success he dreamed of. Carpentry gave him steadier income than acting ever had. He was skilled with his hands. He could measure, cut wood, create sturdy and tangible things. Unlike an acting career, which was fragile and dependent on other people's gaze, sometimes, amid the sound of sawing and the smell of fresh wood, he wondered if he should just give up the old dream entirely. Maybe he wasn't born to be an actor. Maybe the people who said he had nothing special were right. The occasional bit parts still came. A small scene in a television show, a fleeting face on the big screen, but no turning point, no breakthrough. 10 years passed like that, not loud, not glorious, just the persistent drag of trying without moving forward. This wasn't the explosive failure that makes headlines. This was the silent, repetitive failure, day after day. Some nights, after the kids were asleep, Ford sat alone and thought about the path he had taken. He was no longer the passionate 22-year-old. He was approaching 30. In Hollywood, age isn't just a number. Young stars appeared every year. New faces replaced the old ones. He wondered what happens when a dream doesn't die, but also doesn't live. When it's not strong enough to carry you forward, but not weak enough to let go. It was in that limbo that Harrison Ford nearly walked away from acting. He later said that if not for those small unexpected opportunities that appeared, he might have stayed a carpenter forever. Not because he hated acting, but because he couldn't keep putting his entire family into a gamble with no signs of winning. Pragmatism began to overtake the dream, but that dream, however faint, hadn't completely gone out. Those 10 invisible years shaped him in ways no school ever could. They taught him how to endure rejection without collapsing, taught him to work hard even when no one was clapping, taught him that his worth couldn't depend solely on other people's looks. But at the time he didn't see those lessons. He only saw a string of years passing without clear progress. This was the longest failure in Harrison Ford's life. Not the plane crash, not the on-set injuries, but 10 years standing on the sidelines, watching others step into the light. And in that darkness, a big question grew in his mind. If I'm never chosen, do I have the courage to keep believing? Those invisible years didn't create a star, but they created a man resilient enough that, when the final opportunity knocked, he didn't turn away. Those invisible years weren't just waiting time. They were the time Harrison Ford watched other people's dreams become reality, while his own stayed still. By day he wasn't under studio lights. He stood in half-built houses, tape measure in hand, hammer and saw, the smell of fresh wood clinging to his clothes. He became a skilled carpenter, not out of passion, but because he had to live. The straight-cut boards, the perfectly fitted doors, the finished kitchen cabinets under his hands, gave others a sense of security. But every time he looked at a completed project, he couldn't help thinking one thing: I'm building spaces for others to shine in, while my own career doesn't exist. He once worked for names that later became legends. He fixed houses for Francis Ford Coppola. He built cabinets for directors and producers who were busy creating big films. There was a quiet irony in it. The man who wanted to be an actor was helping others perfect the settings for their cinematic dreams. Standing in a famous director's kitchen, installing a sturdy bookshelf, he knew that somewhere out there, a new movie was being planned, and he wasn't in it. Some afternoons, as sunlight streamed through half-installed windows, Harrison would pause, wipe sweat from his brow, and listen to the homeowners talk. They spoke about scripts, roles, upcoming deals. He didn't interrupt. He just worked. He didn't want anyone's pity, didn't want anyone to think he was fishing for a chance. But deep down, he knew he still craved that phone call, that invitation, that role big enough to prove the past 10 years weren't meaningless. Carpentry gave him steadier income than acting ever had. He could support his family. He could pay rent on time. He could buy milk for his kids, without worrying whether the next film would pay enough. But that stability came with a quiet sadness. Each day passing without progress in his acting career felt like a small period placed on the dream of his youth. No one said he failed. No one mocked him. But Hollywood's silence hurt more than any criticism ever could. Perhaps the most painful thing wasn't being a carpenter, but being a carpenter for the very people who had already achieved the success he once dreamed of. When he saw promotional photos for new films hanging on the walls of a director's house, Harrison knew he had enough talent to stand in front of the camera. At least he believed so. But that belief grew thinner over time. He began to wonder if his persistence was just naivety. And then there were nights when, after coming home from a long day of work, he would sit down and think about the years that had passed. He was no longer the young man fresh in Los Angeles. He was past 30. In Hollywood, that meant you were slowing down in a race you had never really started. His peers had either succeeded or given up. Harrison stood in the middle, not successful enough to be remembered, not failed enough to completely let go. His silent tragedy had no screams. It lay in watching other people's success unfold right in front of him every day. Every new movie hitting theaters was a reminder that he wasn't on that list. Every premiere party he wasn't invited to left a small void in his heart. But instead of resentment, he kept working. He kept measuring, cutting wood, assembling. He kept sending audition tapes, even though the rejections outnumbered the callbacks. It was in that monotonous repetition that Harrison Ford learned something that would later become the foundation of his career: patience. He no longer waited for a miracle. He just did his part, day after day. And perhaps, if he hadn't spent those years building dreams for others, he would never have understood the value of building himself from the inside out. But at that moment, he didn't know that the doors he was installing for others would lead him to the defining door of his own life. He only knew he was still unseen, and that more than poverty or loud failure was the deepest pain of a man who had once felt he wasn't enough. The doors he installed for others eventually led him to a door he wasn't even looking for. In the early 1970s, while Harrison Ford was still working as a carpenter to support his family, he took a job fixing up an office for a young director named George Lucas. It wasn't an audition. It wasn't a planned opportunity. Just another manual labor gig, like so many others. But during those visits to the office, Lucas learned that Ford had made a brief appearance in American Graffiti and was still pursuing acting. When Lucas began preparing for an ambitious science fiction project called Star Wars, he needed someone to read lines opposite the other actors during casting sessions. Harrison wasn't the main candidate. He was just asked to come in and deliver dialogue to help the younger faces audition. There was a quiet irony in it. After 10 years of rejection, he walked back into an audition room not to be chosen, but to help others get chosen. At age 35, Harrison Ford was no longer Hollywood's promising young man. In that industry, 35 could sometimes be too late to start over. Leading roles usually went to fresher faces, more malleable, easier to mold. He stepped into the audition room with the mindset of someone used to having no expectations placed on him, no explosive confidence, no loud ambition, just the quiet professionalism of a man far too familiar with being overlooked. When he read the lines of a character named Han Solo, a gruff but charming space smuggler, he didn't overact. He didn't try to impress. He just delivered the dialogue as if it were part of him, straightforward, slightly sarcastic, unadorned, and that naturalness made George Lucas pause. Lucas wasn't looking for a perfect hero. He needed someone who carried a bit of grit, a bit of real-life weariness. And Harrison, with 10 years of failure and days spent building cabinets, carried that authenticity. He didn't know he was being considered for the role. He still thought he was just there to support the casting. When the official offer came, it didn't feel like a blazing thunderbolt. It felt like a door cracking open. He was 35, too old to be the new rising star. Too many years had passed in the shadows. Success, if it came, was arriving too late by Hollywood's rhythm. But perhaps because it came late, it carried a deeper fear. What if this is the last chance? What if he lost it again? Harrison Ford didn't embrace the role of Han Solo with naive excitement. He embraced it with the caution of someone who had been rejected many times. He knew how fragile success could be. He knew a contract could end with one cold decision. Those 10 invisible years had taught him not to believe promises too soon. Even as Star Wars exploded beyond expectations, he kept a part of himself skeptical. Would this light last, or was it just a brief spark before the darkness returned? When the film premiered in 1977 and became a global phenomenon, Harrison Ford walked out of the theater with a feeling he struggled to name. It wasn't just joy, it was relief, and also fear. Late success has a different shade. It's no longer innocent. It comes with the clear awareness that everything can vanish at any moment. He had stood on the sidelines too long to believe the spotlight would shine on him forever. In later interviews, people often asked him about the moment he was cast in Star Wars as if it were a miracle. But that miracle was built on the foundation of 10 years of failure. If Harrison Ford hadn't gone through being deemed nothing special, perhaps he wouldn't have brought that depth to the character. Han Solo isn't a perfect hero. He's someone who has doubted, run away, questioned. And perhaps because Harrison had been that way too, the role came alive. Yet even when success arrived, the childhood feeling of not enough hadn't completely vanished. He didn't see himself as a born star. He saw himself as a lucky man given a chance after too many failures. And deep down, he knew that if he didn't grip this opportunity tightly, if he didn't work harder than anyone else, he could end up back with the hammer and the wooden boards. At age 35, Harrison Ford wasn't just starting a career, he was starting a new battle, the battle to hold on to the light he had waited far too long to receive. But light when it shines too long and too brightly, can become the thing that blinds you to the way out. When Star Wars exploded in the summer of 1977, no one, not even George Lucas, could predict the scale of the earthquake it would cause. Lines stretched around theaters, kids wore Jedi robes, toys, comics, posters, lines repeated in living rooms across America. And at the center of that phenomenon was Harrison Ford, the 35-year-old man who once built cabinets to survive, now the face of a galaxy far, far away. Fans didn't just love Han Solo, they worshipped him. The coolness mixed with charm, the half-challenging, half-carefree gaze, the line "May the Force be with you" echoing in millions of hearts. Harrison stepped out of a restaurant in Los Angeles and realized he was no longer invisible. Strangers called his name. Strangers touched his arm. Cameras flashed. He couldn't walk down the street like before. He couldn't sit in a coffee shop without being recognized. Fame didn't knock. It smashed the door down and flooded in. There was a profound irony in that. For 10 years he had craved to be seen. And when he finally was seen, he discovered he could no longer be alone. No more quiet afternoons in the woodworking shop. No more days passing unnoticed. Instead, there was uncontrollable frenzy. Letters poured in. Invitations appeared on television. Autograph sessions stretched for hours. The flashbulbs never turned off. But beneath that glamorous shell, a new anxiety took shape. Harrison Ford didn't want to be Han Solo forever. He didn't want to be trapped in a space vest and a laser gun. He understood that Hollywood tends to cling tightly to a successful image and repeat it until the audience grows tired. He feared that 10 years of invisibility would be replaced by another form of invisibility, being seen too much in a single form, to the point where no one saw the real person anymore. When the script for the next Star Wars film was being written, Ford bluntly expressed his wish that Han Solo should die. He believed death would add weight to the story, give the character a meaningful end. But perhaps, deeper down, it was his way of trying to free himself from the overwhelming shadow of the role. He didn't want his career imprisoned in a fictional galaxy. He wanted to try other roles, more complex characters, different stories beyond the Lucas universe. Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi continued to achieve massive success. The mania didn't fade at all. Harrison became one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. But every time he was asked about Han Solo, he answered with restraint, sometimes laced with a touch of irony, not because he hated the role, but because he feared being swallowed by it. Fame can be armor, but it can also be a cage. At airports, crowds pressed in. At hotels, security lined the hallways. He learned to walk faster, talk less, keep more distance. Privacy, the thing he hadn't even realized he had, now became a luxury. The man who had lived 10 years in the shadows now had no shadows left to hide in, and there were nights, returning to a hotel room after a premiere, when he looked in the mirror and wondered, do they really know who I am, or do they only know Han Solo? The tragedy of this phase wasn't a downfall, it was the tension. Harrison Ford didn't lose his career, he wasn't abandoned. On the contrary, he was placed at the pinnacle, but at that pinnacle, he paid the price with the simplest freedom, being himself without being tied to an icon. The man who saved a galaxy on screen couldn't save his own freedom in real life. And then, amid the applause and the giant posters, a quiet determination took shape. He would not let Han Solo be his only story. He would keep seeking other roles, other challenges, even if it meant stepping out of the safe zone of fame. Fame could be a prison, but Harrison Ford wasn't one to stay easily in a locked room, and it was in that very anxiety that a new chapter of his life began to open, one where the fedora hat would replace the laser gun, and another hero would be born. And then the fedora appeared, not just as a movie prop, but as a new destiny. In 1981, when Raiders of the Lost Ark premiered, Harrison Ford was no longer the space smuggler. He became Indiana Jones, the adventurous archaeologist, the man running through collapsing temples, leaping from speeding trucks, facing snakes, bullets, and history itself. If Han Solo brought him fame, Indiana Jones granted him immortality in American culture. But immortality on screen didn't mean no limits off screen. From the very first scenes, Ford chose a harder path, performing many of the dangerous stunts himself instead of leaving them entirely to stunt doubles, not out of arrogance, but because he believed the truth on screen came from the actor's real body. When he slid under the truck in Raiders, when he was dragged across the ground in Temple of Doom, when he jumped off a cliff in Last Crusade, it wasn't just special effects, it was real flesh and bone. Every fall left a mark, every impact etched an invisible scar into his body. While filming Temple of Doom, he suffered a serious back injury that required surgery. His spine ached, muscles spasmed, but he still returned to the set. In the action scenes, he gritted his teeth through the pain, not because he didn't feel it, but because he understood that the hero on screen couldn't afford to show weakness, and gradually, a pressure built, the pressure to never age. Indiana Jones has no wrinkles. Indiana Jones doesn't slow down. Indiana Jones always gets up after every fall and keeps running, but Harrison Ford was different. Each passing year, his body reminded him that time doesn't care about icons. Knees stiffened, shoulders hurt more, back throbbed sharper on cold mornings. When Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull premiered in 2008, Harrison was past 60. Audiences still wanted to see him run, jump, fight like 30 years earlier. Hollywood wanted the same. And he, the man who once feared being trapped by Han Solo, now willingly shouldered the fedora again. But that hat felt heavier now, not because the material changed, but because of an entire generation's expectations. There is a silent tragedy in carrying an immortal image for decades. Every time he stepped onto a set, Harrison Ford had to prove he was still strong enough, that age hadn't caught up, that his body hadn't betrayed him. And when Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was made, he was 80 years old. That role wasn't just a sequel, it was a challenge to his own limits. During filming, he dislocated his shoulder, another injury, another reminder of how much the body can endure. But he didn't give up. He did physical therapy, returned to the set, put the leather jacket back on, and wore the fedora again. People saw Indiana Jones still standing there, but they didn't see the evenings he had to ice his shoulder. They didn't see the nights when the pain kept him from sleeping. The motif of this phase is truly cruel. The hero has to be strong, even when he's no longer strong. Audiences loved him for that resilience. But resilience doesn't exempt a person from pain. Harrison Ford never claimed to be a Superman. He was just a man doing his job. But when you become an icon, the world expects you never to change. And perhaps what makes this story even more tragic is the contradiction between the image and reality. On screen, Indiana Jones charges through dangers with a half-sarcastic smile. In real life, Harrison Ford walks more carefully, listening to every small signal from his body. On screen, the hero always returns whole. In real life, each film leaves another scar. The fedora became the symbol of adventure, but for Harrison Ford, it was also a symbol of responsibility. Responsibility to the audiences who grew up with him. Responsibility to himself, that he wouldn't let time defeat his will too easily. Yet at 80 years old, he knew something Indiana Jones would never have to know: every adventure eventually comes to an end. And when he stood in front of the camera for the last time wearing that hat, perhaps he wasn't just playing a character, he was confronting himself with the years that had passed, with the injuries that had accumulated, with the truth that the hero on screen can be immortal, but the man behind the hat is not. But if the injuries on set left scars on his body, the cracks in his private life left far deeper scars, invisible, but always present. When Harrison Ford stepped into the spotlight of Star Wars and Indiana Jones, that light didn't just shine on him, it also illuminated the most private corners of his life, and it was there that the fragile things began to break. His first marriage to Mary Marquardt was built during the years of hardship, before fame, before the pressure. They married when Ford was still a young man with nothing in hand, only dreams and bit parts. Mary stood by him through the carpentry days, through failed auditions, through nights when money was tight. But when success arrived, sudden, overwhelming, without warning, that quiet foundation began to shake. Fame doesn't just change one person, it changes the rhythm of an entire family. Packed shooting schedules, long trips away, media pressure, the public's gaze. And in the middle of it all, two people who had grown up together began to drift into different rhythms. There was no loud explosion, no major scandal at the time, just a gradual distance, one that grew with every premiere, every new contract. That marriage ended in 1979, just as Ford crossed the threshold of global success. Then came his second marriage to Melissa Matheson, a talented screenwriter behind E.T. They met when he was already a star. Their life was surrounded by film, by parties, scripts, future plans. For many years they built a family, had children, shared quiet moments. But fame never truly left Harrison Ford. It followed him into every room, every trip, every workday. During that time he had an affair with Carrie Fisher, his co-star in Star Wars. The truth only came out years later in Fisher's memoir, and it wasn't told with anger, but with the honesty of two young people who made mistakes in a context far too big for them to control. Ford didn't deny it. He didn't react loudly. He chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that some things can't be fixed with explanations. The second divorce in 24 wasn't just a legal event. It was a milestone showing that even screen heroes aren't immune to everyday breakups. The media didn't miss the chance to exploit it. The asset division numbers made headlines. Sensational titles appeared. But amid all the noise, Harrison Ford didn't respond. He held no press conference. He wrote no open letter. He offered no defense. There's a very particular kind of loneliness when you're famous. People think you're surrounded by crowds, attention, public love. But that very attention makes it hard to keep the most private things private. Harrison Ford was never one to talk about his emotions on camera. He kept silence as a form of self-protection. But that silence also meant carrying a lot inside. The cost of ambition isn't always measured in money or physical injuries. Sometimes it's measured in evenings absent from home, in missing important moments, in conversations postponed because a shoot ran a few hours longer. Harrison Ford loved his work, but that work demanded everything, and sometimes it left gaps in the closest relationships. No one in this story is completely right or completely wrong, just people trying to balance the spotlight and family, ambition and love. And in that process, Harrison Ford made mistakes, like any other human being. But instead of turning those mistakes into a loud story, he chose to live with them quietly. Behind the adventure vests and the applause, there was a man who once wondered if he could hold on to anything lasting, not because he lacked love, but because he had spent most of his life running from failure, running toward opportunity, running to meet the responsibility of an icon. And in that run, sometimes he didn't stop long enough to see the fragile things beside him. The tragedy of this chapter isn't in the scandal, it's in the realization that even heroes can be lonely. Even the man who saves the world on screen can't always save the most precious things in his own life. And perhaps in those very breakups, Harrison Ford began to understand that real strength isn't never making mistakes, it's learning to keep living with them, without resentment, without running away, just quietly moving forward. The breaks in love make a person go quiet, but one day, that silence is torn apart by a different sound, the sound of metal ringing through the air. On March 5, 2015, the sky above Santa Monica was clear blue as usual. Harrison Ford, 72 years old, sat in the cockpit of his beloved classic Ryan PT-22 recruit plane. He wasn't an amateur pilot. He had logged thousands of hours in the air, had taken part in search and rescue, and knew every signal on the instrument panel by heart. Flying was part of the freedom he always sought, a place with no cameras, no pressure, just the sky and the wind. Then the engine faltered. It wasn't a big explosion, it wasn't a cinematic spectacle, just a sudden loss of breath, a strange vibration. The needles on the gauges wavered. Harrison tilted his ear to listen, the reflex of someone long accustomed to the sky. He tried to adjust. No response. The engine died. In the narrow cockpit, there was no dramatic soundtrack, just a pounding heartbeat, and the wind howling louder as thrust vanished. He looked down. The ground was rushing closer. A golf course lay below. No runway, not many options, just a few seconds to decide. He gripped the controls, trying to keep the plane stable. The hands that once held a leather whip and a laser gun on screen now clutched the yoke with every ounce of strength. 72 years old, no longer the man from 30 years earlier, but the instinct was still there, calm, focused, no panic. The silence of the dead engine created a terrifying void. In that moment, Harrison Ford understood clearly that he was falling, not metaphorically, literally falling. Wind whipped against the fuselage, metal shuddered. The propeller slowed as if time itself were stretching out. He thought of his family, of Callista, of his children, of quiet mornings in Wyoming, of stepping off sets to roaring applause, and a fleeting thought passed, not dramatic, not heroic, just simple. Maybe this is how Indiana Jones ends, not in a collapsing temple, not amid explosions, but in a small plane, on a sunny afternoon. The ground came closer. He tried to keep the nose level, couldn't let it flip, couldn't let it plow straight down. He aimed for a gap between the trees on Penmar Golf Course. No time left for fear, only reflexes. Then the impact, metal ground into earth, wings snapped. The shock rippled through his body. His head slammed hard, his pelvis shattered, his body was crushed in the cockpit. A moment of whiteout. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the air. He lay amid the wreckage. The smell of fuel, the smell of hot metal, the distant sound of people running toward him. Pain, a sharp, piercing pain through his hip and back. His head spun, but he was alive. Witnesses said he was conscious, trying to free himself from the seatbelt. Rescue crews arrived quickly. They cut through the metal and pulled him out. As he was placed on the stretcher, Harrison Ford wasn't Indiana Jones. He was a 72-year-old man, face pale, body bearing severe injuries. The hospital confirmed broken pelvis, broken ankle bones, head trauma, a list long enough to make anyone his age think about retirement. The news spread across America. TV channels interrupted programming. Social media exploded. Fans worried. An icon had just fallen from the sky. But in the hospital room, there were no flashbulbs, no swelling heroic music, just the steady beeping of heart monitors. Harrison Ford lay still, facing a truth he had avoided for years. The body is not immortal. No take two, no director calling cut and starting over. There were nights during recovery when he woke from the pain. A broken pelvis is one of the hardest things for an older person to heal from. Walking became a challenge. Those first steps after the crash didn't look like Indiana Jones striding forward. They were slow, cautious, and full of ache. But what made that event the climax of his life wasn't just the level of danger, it was the fragility laid bare. In those few seconds in the air, between the engine cutting out and the ground rushing up, Harrison Ford was no longer an icon. He was a human being, and perhaps that direct confrontation with death changed him more deeply than any role ever did. After the crash, many people urged him to stop. 72 years old was already a long journey. He had everything: fame, money, legacy. But Ford wasn't one to let go easily. Just like those invisible years in Hollywood, just like the injuries on film sets, he chose to stand up again, not to prove anything to the world, but because he wasn't ready to end his story with a fall. Maybe this is how Indiana Jones ends. He had thought that once. But Harrison Ford wasn't finished, and when he left the hospital, walking slowly, body still in pain, he carried a new awareness. Immortality exists only on screen. In real life, every heartbeat is a privilege, and every day he woke up after that crash was a next chapter he hadn't been sure he would get. But surviving doesn't mean returning to the way things were. After that accident, Harrison Ford didn't walk out of the hospital like a hero in a movie's final scene. He walked out on crutches, with a heavy body and a months-long physical therapy schedule. At 72, recovery wasn't a matter of a few weeks of rest. It was a quiet battle between willpower and biology. The physical therapy sessions began in a white room, under soft lights and with supportive equipment. The therapist asked him to lift his leg just a little, a small movement, but with a once shattered pelvis, every centimeter was a challenge. The pain wasn't loud like the moment of impact. It was dull, persistent, a constant reminder that the body was no longer in its 30s or 40s. Sometimes he had to hold onto the parallel bars just to stand. A simple motion, something Indiana Jones could do in a split second, now required full concentration and patience. He practiced walking step by step, slow, careful. Some days showed progress, some days stepped back, and on those days of setback, the question began to arise: is it time to stop? Back pain had once been the aftermath of action scenes. Now it was a companion every morning. Shoulder pain, the legacy of years of performing his own stunts, stabbed when he reached for something. Occasionally his wrists stiffened, his spine protested when he sat too long. There was no soundtrack to mask that reality, just the body speaking in its own way. Harrison Ford never liked talking about his pain in public, but in the rehab room, there was no image to protect, just an older man trying to regain the ability to walk normally. The physical therapists didn't care that he was Han Solo or Indiana Jones. They cared whether he could lift his leg high enough, rotate his hip flexibly enough, hold his balance long enough. There were moments when he felt so exhausted that he wanted to give up, not because he lacked courage, but because his body was sending signals that it had been working for 50 years. Maybe it was time to let it rest. He had a career that many people only dared to dream of. He had built a legacy. No one would blame him if he chose to stop, but the issue wasn't what others thought. It was whether he still wanted to keep going. The love for acting, for the sky, for challenging roles was still there. But that love now had to converse with biological limits. It was no longer a race against Hollywood. It was a dialogue with his own body. A new humility emerged in this phase. He no longer threw himself into every action scene without thinking. He listened more, rested more, trained not to prove he was strong, but to maintain the ability to live independently and freely. Each steadier step was a small victory. Each completed therapy session was an affirmation that he was still here. In the quiet mornings in Wyoming, when sunlight streamed through the window and he walked slowly out to the porch, Harrison Ford understood that relearning to walk wasn't just a physical process. It was a redefinition of himself. He no longer had to be the fastest man on screen. He just needed to be the man who didn't give up on himself. And gradually, the steps became more certain. The pain didn't disappear completely, but he learned to live with it. The body didn't recover like before, but the will remained. The question, is it time to stop, didn't vanish. It still lingered somewhere, but instead of answering it with fear, he answered with action, by continuing slower, wiser, but still continuing. And then, when many believed the 2015 crash might be the end of his great adventures, Harrison Ford once again put on the fedora. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny wasn't just another sequel. It was a slow, years-long farewell to the character, to the audience, and perhaps to a part of himself. When he stepped onto the set nearing 80 years old, Ford clearly understood something he hadn't had to think about 30 years earlier. This might be the last time. No more pressure to prove he was as youthful as before. No more race against the new generation of action stars. This time he stepped into Indiana Jones with a profound awareness of time. The character aged, the world changed, and the hero had to face that too. During filming, his body still resisted. His shoulder dislocated in a fight scene. Shooting had to pause, but Ford came back, not to show defiance, but because he wanted to end the story the right way. He didn't want Indiana Jones to fade in silence. He wanted that hero to have a conclusion, one final step into the light, before the screen went dark. When the film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, the theater was packed, the lights dimmed, familiar images appeared on screen. The leather whip, the fedora, the soundtrack that an entire generation knew by heart. But this time, in every frame, the audience saw not just an adventurous archaeologist, they saw a man who had spent more than 40 years living with that character. When the film ended, the entire room stood up. The applause went on and on. Not a few polite seconds, but a long, heavy ovation, like a thank you. Harrison Ford stood there, lights shining on a face etched with deep wrinkles. He tried to stay composed, but then his eyes welled up, not because the film was perfect, not because of the praise, but because he understood the meaning of that moment. This was the last time. The last time he walked onto a stage with the fedora, the last time he heard that melody play and knew he was part of it, the last time the hero stepped into the sunset, there was a gentle tragedy in that scene. Not the tragedy of sudden loss, but the tragedy of a natural ending. Indiana Jones didn't die in battle. He grew old. He slowed down. He looked back at the past and accepted that his era had passed. And Harrison Ford, standing amid Cannes, seemed to accept the same. In interviews afterward, he spoke of the character with respect, no longer the tension he once had with Han Solo. He no longer wanted the character to die to free himself. He understood that sometimes an ending doesn't need to be epic, it just needs to be honest. Audiences left the theater with a feeling that was both warm and choked up, because they weren't just saying goodbye to a character, they were saying goodbye to a part of their own youth. And at the center of that emotion was Harrison Ford, the man who had grown up with them, aged with them, and still stood there, back straight, even if his steps were slower. The last time the hero stepped into the sunset wasn't a noisy spectacle, no explosions, no collapsing temple, just a longer than usual look, a faint smile, and footsteps heading toward the horizon. On screen, Indiana Jones faded gradually into the twilight. In real life, Harrison Ford left the Cannes stage amid applause that still echoed, and perhaps what touched so many hearts in that moment wasn't the end of a film franchise. It was the truth that even the greatest heroes have to learn to let go, not because they've grown weaker, but because they've gone far enough. After Cannes, after the applause that seemed like it would never end, Harrison Ford went home. No more red carpets, no more lenses, just a quiet room and a mirror on the wall. At 83 years old, he stood in front of the mirror and saw what audiences were also beginning to notice. Time had left clear marks, deeper wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, skin no longer taut like in the Raiders' years, hair completely silver white. No makeup could hide that truth. Time didn't arrive as a shock, it came little by little, year by year, roll by roll, morning by morning, waking up with a back a bit stiffer than the day before. The body slowed not because of a lack of will, but because nature operates by its own rules. He still walked every day, still exercised to stay healthy, but he no longer sprinted, he no longer rose from a chair in one fluid motion. Some mornings, when going down the stairs, he held the handrail a little longer, not out of fear, but out of caution. The man who once swung across chasms with a whip, now considered each step in his own home, and in that moment, he understood that change wasn't failure, it was just a new chapter, even if that chapter wasn't glamorous. But there is something heavier than the wrinkles or the back pain. It is the passing of those from his era, the names that once appeared beside him on movie posters, in interviews at premieres, gradually fading from the timeline. Some passed away, some stepped back from the spotlight. Each piece of sad news is a reminder that his generation is quietly receding into the background. Hollywood has changed too. Digital technology replaced many real stunts. Younger, quicker faces are heavily promoted. New franchises rise. Cinematic universes expand. Harrison Ford is no longer the center of every marketing campaign like in the 1980s or 1990s. He is still respected, still invited to major projects, but his position has shifted. He is no longer the trailblazer. He is the representative of an era that has passed. The tragedy of being 83 is not death. It is not a sudden disappearance. It is the natural feeling of being replaced. No one pushes him off the stage, but the stage gradually changes its lighting, and new characters step in. New audiences grow up with different icons. What was once the center becomes legacy. Harrison Ford is not someone who fights change. He does not speak out against the new generation. He understands that every cycle has its time, but understanding does not mean feeling nothing. When he looks back on his journey, he knows he has lived a life many only dream of. Yet there are still quiet moments when he wonders if the phone stops ringing tomorrow, how will I feel? At 83, facing the mirror is not just seeing wrinkles, it is seeing the entire road traveled, the invisible years, the brilliant years, the injuries, the mistakes, the applause, and the time standing alone in a hotel room after a premiere. He no longer tries to prove anything. no longer chases roles to preserve an image, but he still works, still takes projects if they interest him, not out of fear of being forgotten, but because he still loves the work, and perhaps that love is what sets him apart. Being replaced is something no one wants to admit, but Harrison Ford does not avoid it. He stands before the mirror and accepts that he is no longer the fastest man in the room. He is the man who went the farthest, and in that acceptance, there is a quiet dignity, not loud, not melodramatic, just the calm of someone who has understood that his worth no longer lies in topping the box office charts, but in the indelible marks left in the memory of millions. And then when the Hollywood lights are no longer the center of every day, Harrison Ford finds a different rhythm, slower, quieter, but truer. In Wyoming, amid vast open mountains, and a sky that seems endless, he is no longer a cinematic icon. He is just a man stepping out onto the porch each morning, breathing the cold air and listening to the wind move through the grasslands. Callista Flockhart entered his life at a different point, not when he was climbing to the top, but after he had traveled most of the road. Their love is not loud, not showy. It does not need to prove anything to the world. With Callista, Harrison is not Indiana Jones or Han Solo. He is Harrison, a man who loves to fly, loves working with his hands, loves silence more than talking. Together they built a life far from the bright lights of Los Angeles. In Wyoming, there are no red carpets, no paparazzi waiting. There are afternoons riding horses across wide fields, evenings sitting by the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle. He once said that nature makes him feel part of something bigger, yet simpler. There, no one cares how many movies you have made. They only care if you can fix a fence. His children and grandchildren became the center of that life. Harrison Ford, who once spent years rushing between sets, now spends more time with family. He drives the kids to school. He listens to their stories. He learns to listen more than speak. Perhaps age brings a patience that youth did not allow. There are mornings when he rides horseback down long dirt trails, the sound of hooves tapping steadily on the ground. No applause, no swelling heroic score, just a heartbeat and breath blending into the vast space. And in those moments he no longer thinks about box office numbers or upcoming roles. He thinks about presence, about simply being here alive, feeling. The silence of Wyoming is not emptiness, it is healing. After years surrounded by crowds, by the noise of expectation, Harrison Ford finds value in the quiet spaces. Perhaps the tragedy of aging slowly turns into peace right there, when he no longer tries to hold on to an image, but simply lives true to who he is. He still flies, but flying is no longer a challenge. It is personal joy. He still works, but not out of fear of being forgotten. He fixes small things around the house. He walks through the fields with Callista. They talk about simple things. No more relentless interviews. No more packed schedules. If in Hollywood he once had to prove he was strong enough, in Wyoming he has nothing to prove. That peace did not come easily. It was built from years of hurt, from near-death moments, from broken relationships and long nights of reflection. The tragedy does not disappear completely. It is still there in memories of friends who have gone, in the lingering aches in his back and shoulders, but it no longer rules him. It sits beside gratitude. The tragedy of growing old gradually gives way to appreciation for each remaining day, and as sunset falls over the Wyoming mountains, soft golden light covering his face, Harrison Ford is no longer the hero charging through stone traps. He is a man who has lived nearly a full century, who has stood at the peak and also fallen, now finding peace in the simplest thing, slowing down. The tragedy is no longer a painful echo. It becomes a gentle soundtrack for a final chapter that is not loud but complete. But even in the peace of Wyoming, some things cannot be left behind. The body always remembers. It records every fall, every impact, every time he threw himself into danger for a perfect shot. 60 years working in that unforgiving industry did not pass without leaving traces. Harrison Ford may step away from the lights, but his body still carries the old chapters like pages that cannot be torn out. His shoulder dislocated while filming Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. His back underwent surgery, Back in the 1980s, his pelvis shattered in the plane crash of 2015. Wrists, knees, neck, not a single part remains completely intact. Every morning before getting out of bed, he has to listen to his body the way someone relearns an old language. Is the back aching more today? Is the shoulder flexible enough to raise his arm high? Chronic pain is not a storm. It is a long, steady drizzle, not fierce, but unrelenting. There are nights when he does not sleep deeply, not from anxiety, but because his body wakes itself with dull, persistent aches. He turns slowly, searching for a less painful position. Perhaps audiences never think of that when they see him walking the red carpet, but behind that tailored suit is a body that has worked too long. 60 years, 6 decades in front of the camera, 6 decades of grueling schedules, constant flights, action scenes demanding absolute focus. He was not an actor who just showed up and delivered lines. He threw himself into the roles. He accepted risks that many his age had long refused, and each of those choices came with a price. There is a clear contrast between the on-screen image and reality. On-screen Indiana Jones never falls without getting up immediately. Han Solo can be shot, can fall, but always comes back with that sarcastic smile. Audiences are used to seeing him invincible, but in real life, Harrison Ford has fallen many times literally. He was dragged across the ground during Raiders. He slammed into a metal door in The Fugitive. He was injured performing action at an age when many have retired. The body does not distinguish between cinema and reality. It only responds to force, and that force, accumulated over decades, becomes persistent pain. Some days he feels like a map covered in markers, each one a memory, a scar, a lesson. But what makes the price of immortality heavier is not just the injuries. It is the expectation. When you become an icon, people want you to stay strong forever. They want you never to slow down. They want you to step onto the stage with the same energy as 40 years ago. Harrison Ford understands that. He does not blame the audience. They love him for that image, but maintaining that image for decades means constantly pushing past his own limits. Perhaps that is why he has never seen himself as immortal. He knows the limits clearly, knows bones no longer heal as fast, knows a fall at 80 is very different from one at 30, but he keeps going, not to defy time, but because he loves the work too much to abandon it easily. In Wyoming, when night falls and the house falls silent, Harrison Ford feels the price he has paid most clearly, not through regret, but through slower movements, through reminding aches, and sometimes, a small smile when he remembers a scene completed even though his body wanted to refuse. On screen, he never falls without getting up right away. In real life, he has fallen. In love, in career, in the air, on set. But each fall was not an ending. They were proof that he lived true to every moment. The price of being immortal in the public eye is accepting that you are finite in real life. Harrison Ford does not avoid that. He carries his scars like invisible medals, not to show off, but to remind himself that every achievement was built on sacrifice. And if anything in his story touches other hearts, perhaps it is not that he never fell, but that he fell many times and still chose to stand up, even if his steps are slower now. So ultimately, what really happened to Harrison Ford at 83? There was no dramatic collapse, no bankruptcy, no self-destruction like so many other Hollywood legends, no decades-long dark scandal, no noisy trials, no headlines about downfall. If anyone was waiting for a dramatic tragedy, they would be disappointed, because what happened to Harrison Ford is not a catastrophe. It is far quieter, and because of that, far more painful. He paid a price, not with fame, not with wealth, but with time. At 83, what touches Harrison Ford is not scandal, not destruction, but the simple, non-negotiable truth. Time has finally reached the man who was once immortal on screen. His body has slowed. Steps are no longer long and swift, like in the Raiders' days. Nights are no longer deep like in youth. Mornings take more minutes to get the joints moving. He does not talk much about it. He does not complain. But the body is an honest record. It does not lie. What really happened is not one specific event, but accumulation. 60 years of work, hundreds of days shooting under blazing sun, in rain, in cold, falls that audiences cheered for, Wounds only he and his doctors truly know, long flights, endless travel, smiling through exhaustion. He did not collapse, but he wore down. That wearing down is not loud. It does not appear in a movie scene. It happens in the silence of the Wyoming house, in morning light on silver hair, in the moment he sits down a little slower than before. Hollywood once built him as the icon of American masculine strength, laconic, tough, always moving forward. But at 83, Harrison Ford no longer needs to uphold that image. He no longer has to prove he is the fastest, strongest, or bravest in the room. He just needs to be himself, a man who has lived fully. Some think the greatest tragedy is losing everything, but there is another subtler tragedy, watching the things that once defined you slowly change, not because you failed, but because of natural law. Time has not been cruel to Harrison Ford the way it was to other stars. It did not yank him from the lights violently. It simply touched him, gently but surely. And perhaps what makes this story choke people up is not that he aged, but that we aged with him. We once watched him run across deserts with a whip, heard him say "I know" in Star Wars, and smiled, believed he would always be there, unchanged. But the hero on screen never truly belongs to time. The human being behind him does. At 83, Harrison Ford does not fight aging with denial. He does not get surgery to erase the marks of years. He does not pretend to be younger. He stands there, with wrinkles, with a slightly stiff back, with more cautious steps, and accepts. That is not surrender. That is final maturity. He did not collapse. He did not go bankrupt. He did not destroy himself. But he paid for every moment of glory. What really happened to Harrison Ford at 83 is not scandal, not catastrophe, but what happens to all of us. If we are lucky enough to live long enough, we become clearly finite. The man once immortal on screen now walks slower, speaks slower, listens more, and there is a beauty in that slowing. A beauty youth can never understand, because in the end, Harrison Ford's legacy is not in whether he ever fell, it is in how he stood up quietly, without show, and kept walking until he no longer needed to prove anything. The hero does not live forever, but dignity does. Looking back at Harrison Ford's entire journey in this story, what chokes us is not a spectacular downfall, but the quiet erosion of a man once seen as immortal. From the boy born in 1942, who always felt not enough, to 10 invisible years in Hollywood building cabinets to support his family, to the 2015 plane crash that shattered his pelvis at 72, every detail shows his success was built not on privilege, but on persistence. When he stood at Cannes for the last time wearing the fedora, and tears came during the long applause, it was not just a farewell to a role, it was the moment an American generation realized time had touched their hero too. The lingering back pain, the dislocated shoulder during Dial of Destiny, the nights of shallow sleep at 83, all are the price of 60 years of relentless work. But what commands respect is that he does not resent it, does not try to rejuvenate his image, does not turn aging into media tragedy. He chooses peaceful living in Wyoming, riding horses, being with Callista and his children, accepting he has gone far enough. For Americans, a nation that values the individual, achievement and resilience, Ford's story reminds us that the American dream does not guarantee you will escape hurt, but it gives you the chance to stand back up. True strength is not in never growing old, but in how you hold your dignity when age arrives. Harrison Ford no longer runs like before, but he still stands tall, and that is the most precious legacy. If Harrison Ford's story has touched your heart, please hit subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the dignified journeys behind Hollywood's spotlight. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you in the next video, where we dive deeper into the people who taught us how to stand firm against time.